What's up guys, Huggy here. When this comes out, this will be the 18th episode of my poker vlog. I'm at the Lodge in Round Rock, Texas today. It's the day after Thanksgiving. Hope you had a happy Thanksgiving. By the time this comes out, it'll probably be way past the holiday, but hope you enjoyed your time off if you had any. Got to visit with family and friends. I'm going to play some 1-2 no limit today, probably. I brought enough to play 1-3 if things go well, but I'm going to start at 1-2 and see where it goes. So without further ado, let's get into it. 15 minutes into the session, we pick up pocket nines sitting in the +1 position. The end of the gun limps, and I raise to $12. The middle position calls, cutoff calls, button calls, the big blind calls, and we've got 5 players to the flop, which comes 6-6-9 with 2 clubs, so we flop a boat. We're so far ahead on this board that when it checks to me, I check as well, giving other players a chance to catch up. The middle position player leads for $40 now. It folds back to me, and I make the call to slow play. On the turn, we see the 4 of spades. I check again, hoping my hand looks like overcards, giving my opponent a chance to continue. Unfortunately, he checks back this time, and we're headed to the river. The river doesn't change anything when it brings the 3 of hearts. I continue the story with a check again. I know what you're thinking here, and you're right. A bet here makes a lot more sense, not just to ensure we don't lose value with the big hand, but also because all the draws missed. Plus no overcards to the flop came, and by betting here, my opponent could make a thin call as a bluff catcher. Now I'm going to be honest, I didn't get enough sleep the night before this session, and I was pretty tired when I first sat at the table, so I'm not thinking straight. Unfortunately, my poker schedule isn't very flexible. I've got to take sessions when I can, and although I generally don't drink caffeine, I had some tea as a pick-me-up before sitting down. Unfortunately, it hasn't hit me yet at this point. As expected, my opponent checks behind, and we win the minimum here. He goes on to tell me that he flopped top pair with King 9 and said he would have called a $100 bet on the river here, so I definitely butchered this hand, but thankfully the caffeine starts to kick in before the rest of the session. The next interesting hand, we've got King 10 suited in clubs in small blind. The +2 player raises to $15, the middle position calls, the low jack calls, and I call in the small blind. And we've got 4 players to the flop, which comes King 5-9 rainbow, so we've got top pair middle kicker. I check first to act, and the pre-flop raiser leads for $20. Just the player behind him calls, and now it's on me. I'm more worried about the pre-flop raiser than I am about the player behind him. I look at my opponent's stacks, and I realize the pre-flop raiser only has about 60 behind. With top pair, I'm okay getting it in against him here, and I don't want the caller to get a cheap turn with weaker holding, so I put in a check raise, making it $80. Both players quickly fold, and we take the pot down.
Thank you.
About 10 minutes later, we pick up Ace-King suited. I raise to $10 first to act. The player to my left calls, and the next player pushes all in for $34. I don't want the player between us to call cheaply, so when it folds back to me, I put in a pretty big raise. I make it $150 to isolate. I could have definitely made this less, but at the time, I thought the all-in player had a bigger stack. The player between us folds, and we get to see a full run out. I show my hand, but we still don't know what our opponent's got. So we missed the board completely, but my opponent shows he had ace-queen, and we end up scooping the pot.
Thank you.
The very next hand, we pick up ace-9 offsuit sitting in the big blind. The player in the middle position, who we'll call the action player at the table, raises to $10. The low jack calls, the cutoff calls, and I call as well, so we've got 4 players to the flop, and I check dark. The flop comes ace-5-5 with 2 spades. So we've got top pair with a middle kicker. The action player c-bets for $25. This player was legitimately playing 100 VPIP for the first couple orbits when I joined the table, and so I'm not necessarily giving him credit for a big hand here. When the other 2 players fold, I make a pretty easy call with our top pair. The turn brings a third 5. We hit a boat now, and I imagine we're chopping against any other ace at this point. However, I expect this player to bet again with any hand if I check to him, so I do just that, and he ends up betting again for $50. I make an easy call, and the river brings an inconsequential 6 of clubs. I don't want to check and let my opponent check behind, so I push all in now for about $100 effective since I've got him covered. He quickly folds, and we scoop a nice sized pot.
Thank you.
We pick up a few small pots here and there until a half hour later when we look down at pocket jacks sitting under the gun +1. It folds to me, and I raise to $10. The cutoff calls and the small blind calls, so we're 3 ways to the flop. The flop is 3-9-7 rainbow. The small blind checks to me, and I c-bet for $20 with our overpair. The cutoff folds, and the small blind calls, so we're heads up to the turn, where we see the deuce of clubs. The small blind checks to me again, and given that this card is a complete blank, I bet again for $45 this time. He calls once more, so at this point I'm thinking he's probably either got a pair that just wants to get to showdown, or a straight draw against the 9-7 on the board. On the river we see the 4 of hearts. I'm not worried about this card given my opponent's story so far, and although I consider checking behind given how sticky he's been, I feel like I'll be missing value if I do. I bet a third time, making it $65 now. He makes the call, and our read was right. Our pocket jacks are good.
Appreciate it.
15 minutes later, we look down at 4 deuce suited and spades. 2 players limp in, so I limp in as well, sitting in the hijack. The cutoff raises to $15. 4 players make the call, so I decide to join along given the size of the pot. The flop comes 2-3-5 rainbow, so we flop the low end of a straight draw. It checks around to the pre-flop raiser who checks behind, so we get a free turn. And it's a good one, the 6 of clubs. We big the straight, and when it checks to me, I lead now for $35. The pre-flop raiser folds, and we get 2 callers. The river ends up pairing the board with the 3 of diamonds. Given the lack of action so far, I'm not inclined to believe anyone's got a boat at this point, so when it checks to me again, I bet out for $75 this time. Just the player on the right calls all in for his last $65. We show our hand, and he mucks.
Thank you.
The next interesting hand, we've got 9-7 offsuit sitting in the big blind. The under the gun straddles for $5. 2 players make the call, so I decide to call as well. The flop comes 9-2 jack with 2 diamonds, so we've got second pair with a weak kicker. I check, and it ends up checking around. On the turn, we see the 6 of hearts. Given the lack of action on the flop, I decide to lead here for $12. The under the gun straddler and the small blind both call, so we're headed to the river 3 ways. The river ends up pairing the board when it comes the jack of spades. The small blind checks to me, and I consider making a thin value bet, but this feels a little ambitious given that I got 2 callers on the turn, so I ultimately end up checking instead. It checks behind, I announce my hand, and it's good.
Thank you.
About 20 minutes later, we pick up 7-5 suited and clubs sitting on the button. The +1 player raises to $10, and the middle position player re-raises to $20. The players involved in the hand have pretty deep stacks now, so I make a loose cold call here in position. I know this looks like a super loose call, and it might be, but many of our pre-flop raises at this point have been for $15 straight, so cold calling a 3-bet for only $5 more honestly doesn't feel too out of line for the table. I also don't expect the initial raiser to re-raise given the play I've seen so far. The player behind me calls, and as expected, the initial raiser just calls as well, so we've got 4 players to the flop. And on the flop, we see 4 jack ace with 2 clubs. So it's a pretty good flop for us. Any club gives us the flush. It checks to the player who re-raised before the flop, and he c-bets now for $20. It's such a weak bet that I decided to take control of the hand, and I raised to 65 with our draw. Both other players fold, and the initial better calls. The turn brings the 8 of clubs, so we pick up the flush. Our opponent checks now, and I bet again for $100 this time. Perhaps I should have bet a little less, because unfortunately our opponent does not make the call.
Can you chop one of those for me?
Chop one?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
The very next hand, we pick up King 7 suited and hearts sitting in the cutoff. The +1 player raises to 15, the +2 player calls, +3 calls, middle position calls, low jack calls, hijack calls, and I call here given how big the pot is, and both the button and the blinds fold. So we've got a $108 pot brewing with 7 of us headed to the flop. And man, is it a good one when we see 8 ace 6 of hearts. We flop the absolute nuts. The initial raiser checks, and the next player leads for $50. The player behind him calls, and given the massive interest in the hand, I decide not to wait to pull the trigger. I re-raise to $150. It folds back to the initial bettor, who now goes all in for $220 total. The player behind him goes all in as well for $128. I obviously call here and pray that we hold up. The first player shows he's got pocket aces, so we need to avoid the board pairing. The turn brings the 2 of spades, and the river the king of diamonds. Our hand holds up, and we scoop the biggest pot of the session. The third player shows he had queen 10 offsuit with the queen of hearts, so he had a draw to the second nut flush, though he was actually drawing dead on the flop.
Can't beat that. Got lucky. No, you're okay. I'll clean it up.
A little bit later, we look down at pocket queen sitting under the gun +2. It folds to me, and I raise to $10. The button, the small blind, and the big blind all call. The flop comes 8-5-8 with 2 diamonds. We've got an overpair, though any 8 beats us. I continue with the aggression, though, and c-bet for $22 when it checks to me. The cutoff in the small blind call, and the big blind folds, so we've got 3 to the turn. When the turn comes the 10 of hearts, it shouldn't change anything, but when the small blind checks to me now, I check to see what the button does. He opens now for $45. The small blind calls, and although part of me wants to fold given the interest in the hand by both players at this point, I do end up calling as well given the fact that there are 2 flush draws and some straight draws on the board that these opponents could be playing for as well. The river brings a third 8, the 8 of spades. We've got a boat now, though I'm still a bit concerned given the amount of interest in the hand and mostly worried about the player behind me. I end up checking here and the button ends up checking back. As soon as he checks, I'm sure I've got the winner, so I show my hand right away. The button shows he had pocket 5s, so he flopped the boat and unfortunately for him got outdrawn on the river. So my read that he was ahead was right, although I was wrong about how he was ahead. I probably could have bet on the river here to get a little bit more value and fold to a raise, but lesson learned maybe for next time. Not too long after we pick up ace-2 offsuit sitting in a low jack. There's an under the gun straddle for $10, and when it folds to me, although this isn't an ace-high hand that I normally play, I decide to raise to $30 in hopes of winning the extra money from the straddle. The player to my left calls, and the straddler does as well, so we've got 3 players to the flop. The flop comes 6 ace 7 rainbow, so we flop top pair, but we've got the weakest kicker, so when it checks to me, given that the board is pretty dry, I go ahead and check back to see what the player behind me does. He ends up checking as well, so we get a free turn, and it's a good one, the ace of clubs. We pick up trips now, which makes it less likely either of our opponents has an ace. When it checks to me this time, I make a delayed c-bet for $30. The player behind me calls, and the straddler folds, so we're heads up to the river. The river brings the 8 of diamonds. It's unlikely this river changed anything unless my opponent had a gut shot or the bottom end of the straight draw, which I think is unlikely given his check behind on the flop. I don't want to miss out on value, so I lead out again for $70 this time. It seems like our bet is too big though, as he tosses his cards into the muck and we scoop a nice sized pot with what was perhaps a questionable starting hand.
Thank you.
10 minutes later we pick up pocket queen sitting in middle position. The under the gun straddles for $5, and when it folds to me, I raise to $15. Everyone makes the fold though, and we end up just winning the blinds in straddle. Unfortunate to not get more action with this big hand, but I'll still take the win. The next interesting hand we see, we've got king 3 suited in clubs sitting under the gun. I straddle for $5, and the next player calls. It folds to the big blind, who min re-raises to $10. I call, expecting the third player to call as well, and he does, so the 3 of us are headed to the flop, which comes 2-3-9 with 2 clubs. This is a pretty dream flop for us. We flop second pair with the second nut flush draw. The big blind leads now for $25. I consider raising, but given I haven't seen this player raise much, I'm concerned that he has an overpair, and I don't want to get all in even with the amount of equity we've got on this board. With that, I end up just making the call. The player to my left ends up quickly making the call as well, which maybe would have been an argument for raising here instead though. The turn brings the 5 of diamonds. Our hand doesn't improve, and the initial better checks now. This might be a good spot to take the lead, but I'm a little concerned about the player behind me, so I decide to go with a check here instead. Fortunately, he checks as well, so we get a free river, which is the 5 of hearts, pairing the board. The big blind leads now for $50. This bet feels kind of fishy to me, and the story doesn't totally make sense. I'm doubting he has an overpair, and I'm thinking if he has a pair, it's probably a middling pair like 6s or 7s. I really think there's a good chance he's got air though, and I don't think he'd bet $50 on the river with a hand like that. Despite thinking that I might be good against this player, there's still a player behind me to act. He could have a holding that's better than mine. However, I've seen him make some decent top pair folds in multi-way pots previously, and I think if I call here, he might suspect that he's not good even if he's got me beat. Considering that, I end up making the call and the player to my left folds. My opponent shows ace-king and our pair of 3s is good. The player to my left is upset because he said he folded an 8 and he would have called if I didn't. Our assessment of the situation was right, and we end up winning a sizable pot with a pretty weak holding. A few hands later, we've got 9-7 offsuit sitting on the button. The middle position player raises to $10, the cutoff calls, and I decide to call here with position, and the big blind calls as well, so we've got 4 players to a pretty great flop of 9-9-6 with 2 clubs. We flop trips, and I imagine we're way ahead here. There's a flush draw out there, but when it checks to me, I decide to check to give my opponents a chance to hit something. On the turn, we see the 8 of spades. It checks to the cutoff, who opens now for $35. I'd love to keep slow playing this, but the board is pretty wet now with 2 flush draws, and I don't want those draws to get a cheap river. I raise to $110, making it $75 more for the initial better. It folds back to him, and he thinks for a bit, wonders out loud if I'm raising with a flush draw, but ultimately makes the fold. I show my hand, and he tells me he folded ace-8 for second pair, so perhaps a smaller raise would have been better here.
Thank you. That was right. You weren't on a flush draw. Yeah.
We win a few more pots, running our stack up a bit more before the end of the session, but nothing that's really vlog-worthy. I feel my energy start to deplete, so I decide to call it a night. Well, that was a pretty fantastic session. We bought in for 300, cashed out for 2,000 straight. So it was about $50 in hourly cost and tips. So final result is a profit of $16.50. So that puts us at about just shy of the, what is it? I think $7,000 marker. So we're about 70% to the goal of hitting 10K in our bankroll. So gonna keep grinding towards that. It's really exciting. I was hoping to reach out by the end of the year, but it's getting close to the end of the year, so I don't think it's gonna happen, but gonna keep at it either way. Yeah, not too much more to say other than that. Had some, you know, pretty straightforward session, not too many difficult spots. Got pretty lucky to flop a nut flush against a set of aces and have it hold too. So, you know, other than that, it was just kind of mostly standard play, I think, for the most part. But still a nice win. Really happy with it. If you enjoyed this episode of the vlog, please hit the like and subscribe button. Excuse me. Otherwise, we'll see you on the next one. Take care.